Let's just record. Let's just go live. All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Weekend Debrief. It is definitely not the weekend, but we're almost here. We are almost to a long weekend, a long Christmas holiday break. We will not be doing a show next week, so we are here now. I've got Ted Baker from Finger Lakes News Radio here in the studio with me. Ted, we are to the end of 2020, the year that was apparently never going to end.
Can't wait to see what the number one story is.
It's going to be interesting, and can I just say that when I was today we're going to be going through the top 10 most read stories on Finger Lakes 1, and then we're going to be at the end of the show talking about the three biggest questions that are looming from 2020 that will probably be answered in 2021 to some degree. When I was putting together this post that went up over the weekend, I was amazed at how few of these stories were actually connected to COVID. So there were a couple that were like, oh yeah, obviously those were highly read stories. But then there were a lot of other ones that I actually kind of forgot about. A couple that were feel-good stories that it was a nice, refreshing break from the depression that was 2020. So let's get into this. Number 10, and I think this is one of the ones that we'll probably end up talking about a little bit more than the others. BJ's Wholesale shuts down in Geneva. This one happened in the beginning of the year, and I think a lot of people forgot that it happened, but that was announced in January, and by February, the store was closed. It was gone. Interesting because there's a story that we're going to talk about later in the top 10 that also happened in Geneva around the same time that was pretty interesting in terms of what it meant. The store closure stories are always interesting because they always wind up being read more than others. I remember in the middle of the year, I think it was, that Gordman's closed. That was obviously originally Peebles. And they had locations, I think, they had a location in Newark, they had a location in Geneva, and maybe another one down in Penn Yan, possibly, down in Yates County. I believe there was 3 locations altogether. Anyway, the BJ story is interesting because this was one that kind of took people by surprise. It's one of those stores that everybody thinks is just comfortable because of what it's selling. So it's effectively a grocery store. A lot of people who shop at BJ's, and when it closed, because there aren't really any locations that are super proximate to the people who live in that part of Ontario County, it seemed to hit a little harder than maybe other similar closures might have hit. Of course, we saw later in this year that the plan is definitely not a new grocery store in that gigantic space, and it'll actually be climate-controlled storage and then some small retail out in front. Ted, obviously, we see stories like this every year. Stores close, they open. What did you think about this one in terms of how it kind of, in some ways, it felt like it came out of nowhere?
Well, I thought that I wasn't going to get much use out of my membership card going to Victor. That was the next choice for me. I'm wondering if what we're seeing is the data revolution that swept through sports. I have the feeling that they're much better able to track how things are doing, and I think companies have a lot less tolerance, these chains, for underperforming stores. It may not, I don't even know that anybody ever said that store was losing money. It may just be it was in the bottom whatever percent, and corporate management said, why are we running these bottom 10% or whatever it is? Let's get rid of them. I think, because otherwise, it didn't, like you say, it didn't pass the smell test as a failing store. I mean, it was always busy and always seemed to do a lot of business. So I just think that the standards that some companies are using have changed, and I think they're a lot less tolerant now. That you may just see companies say, okay, we're just going to lop off the bottom 10% because we can make more money investing resources into the other 90%.
Yeah, and I think this year also, obviously, this decision came before the pandemic hit. So, right, like this decision was made long before that. It was probably made in later 2019. But yeah, to your point, when I was digging through, one of the quotes that I saw related to this particular story and the closure was that they actually only had a net loss throughout the entire company of one store. So they closed 2 and they opened a new one in Pennsylvania. And the Geneva location, along with one in Florida, were the only 2 that actually got shut down in this, and I think to your point, this probably is a reflection of the data machine that's at play, whether you're in business or whether it's a retail environment or whether it's just general consumer habit. Because what is the pandemic shown us more than anything is that there are a lot of really efficient ways to get whatever it is that you need, whatever household item that you need. My fiance and I have a BJ's membership, and we go to the BJ's that's in Henrietta near us. And, when we first got the membership, I want to say it was like 2.5 or 3 years ago. It was before we really started buying household items on Amazon or off of Amazon. And now that Amazon has that monthly recurring order feature, I tell you what, you can get your packages of multiple items delivered every month without having to do the thinking of going to the store or remembering a list or things like that. I mean, I think if there's a long-term problem for places like BJ's, it's probably that they're trying to compete with Amazon or, more computer-centric processes where BJ's is using humans to try and compete with, and it's not a fair fight in that sense.
Well, right. And I mean, they're selling pretty commoditized products. I mean, you don't need to inspect a 24-pack of tissues before you buy it. You know what you're getting, so it's easier to click. And I think that's one of the things when we go back and look at our overall trends is the trend continuing toward convenience. Consumers want convenience. Yeah. They want DoorDash or Grubhub to deliver dinner right to the door. They don't want to have to go out. And that was even pre-COVID, but it's been exacerbated by COVID, where people say, okay, why do I want to go out, either risk infection or put my mask on and be inconvenienced if I can click and get the same thing right to my door?
And that was the 10th most read story of the year. Coming in at number 9 was one of the better feel-good stories of the year. There was a dog in Canandaigua, a golden retriever in Canandaigua, who broke a Guinness Book of World Record. It was one of those feel-good things. We threw the link up to it on our website in that story. Go back, check it out. There's a video that accompanies it. Had something to do with this dog effectively being able to put a bunch of tennis balls in its mouth, which, I mean, that is prime internet content right there. Another story coming in at number 8 that was Geneva related was obviously Cherry Bundy shutting down and moving out. The company said it was faced with a choice, which we talked about on the show right after it happened: leave Geneva or risk killing the business. They moved to Michigan. There was a lot of debate and a lot of discussion afterwards about the kinds of tax breaks that businesses like Cherry Bundy and others get, especially when they're in that startup phase, when they're, sort of dangling the opportunity of having more employees or hiring more people. You get the different IDA agencies from counties all across the region. They start to salivate a little bit at the opportunity to claim that they brought in, 2, 3, 4, 5 dozen employees. But then a few years down the line, all of a sudden doing business in New York State, those natural pressures that the IDAs and economic development engines are all ultimately compensating for when they're starting up, they become too big of a force even as the company grows, for the company to be able to maintain its operation. So you're left in this, frankly, impossible scenario where, a business is left with, like Cherry Bundy was, a choice. Stay, potentially close, or move and be able to thrive.
Well, and of course, that's their version of the story. I mean, originally they were talking about supply. It seems odd to me that there's not enough of a supply of cherries in one of the biggest cherry growing areas in the country. So you wonder did Michigan just come calling with a better package and more incentives? And it does call into question, we've talked about this a lot, that there's not very much follow-up to take a look at the promises that are made when these companies come in and they take tax breaks and they take basically money out of our pockets to start up and then say, thank you very much for starting us up. I mean, they can say, gee, well, our company wasn't going to succeed. Well, there would have been no Cherry Bundy without all the breaks that you got to start up in New York. So, I mean, maybe there's a case to be made for codifying more of this stuff and saying, if you're going to get this break, you must stay here for X number of years, you must create this many jobs, and they must continue on for this many years. But the problem they run into is that if you put those restrictions on a company, they'll just go to a state that doesn't.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people get frustrated with the appearance that business, especially bigger business or new business or any business, frankly, that declares they're going to hire people, get an unfair advantage or some sort of benefit that the average person does not get. Now, how often do we sit here and talk about, especially now that we're halfway or maybe more than halfway through this pandemic and economic recession that's come along with it, at what point do we start to acknowledge the fact that the everyday people need more benefit or need more economic assistance than any business, at all? And I understand that a lot of people are going to hear that and say, well, what the hell? Small business and big business, they employ people, and if you don't have those, you don't have jobs. We are going to have a ton of people, and this is going to be one of the bigger questions we answer at the end of the show. If we just continue going on the path we're on now, 10, 15 years from now, we are going to have a big problem. We are going to have a lot of people needing a lot of help just to get by because wages are not increasing at the rate of which cost of everything is increasing. It's not happening in balance. It's out of sync. It's been out of sync for decades. And at some point, if you don't overhaul the system, you're going to have the government stepping in to provide more assistance, whether that be the welfare programs that exist now or whether that be just through new sort of economic stimulus. I don't want to call it stimulus, but different efforts at the government level to stimulate the economy itself, since it's not happening at the level that it needs to in the private sector.
Well, we talked about this on the Finger Lakes Morning News just yesterday. The stimulus bill that just passed was $900 billion. If you divide that by the population of the U.S., you get $2,727 per person, which means if you just gave the money in direct aid to people, a family of four would get a check for roughly $11,000. That would go, in my opinion, much farther in actually stimulating the real economy than the bill we passed, which was a mishmash of lobbyist favors and pork and gender studies in Pakistan that we talked about this morning. $10 million went to gender studies in Pakistan. I understand, I don't want to anger business owners, but there's no reason why we should give any money to businesses. Give it to people, and they'll spend it at businesses. I think, I'm no economist, but it seems to me that we're always, there was just a call to not have the minimum wage increase that's set to take place January 1st. It seems to me a lot of businesses are short-sighted in their approach in that they don't understand if you give the money to the people, they'll give it back to you. They'll do business with your business. I mean, if the minimum wage were $50 an hour, businesses would go, oh my God, we can't possibly survive. But how much spending money would all these people have? And they're going to bring it right back to your business. It seems to me the money winds up with businesses anyway. So let's give it to people and let the market decide which businesses we want to succeed. We talk about airlines. They're giving money to the airlines. The airline business is going to look a lot different when this is over. There's going to be a lot less business travel. That industry is going to have to shrink, whether they like it or not. But if we prop them up artificially, it just delays that day of reckoning.
Yeah, and I think there's also, and we see this in a lot of the business related stories that we publish, there's a bit of a misunderstanding about what small business is versus medium-sized business versus large business. And, if anything, you can make an argument that simply reducing the overarching burden on very small businesses would be the most sensible way to approach this, because big businesses, large business, really large businesses are the ones that aren't pulling their share, especially when you look at the number of ways that they can cut corners and they can do this, that, and the other thing. At the end of the day, do they drive, large portions of the economy? Sure, but they're always going to, because, the thing, and, maybe we'll have time to get into the whole debate around Facebook and Google. But one of the things that I keep coming back to, because both are being targeted now by the federal government, one of the things that we can say about Google as opposed to Facebook is that they actually provide an improvement to your life online. The service that they're providing you is such that whether they do it in the way that they do it now or not, people are still going to use the services. Just like Amazon, just like your big businesses are always, until a shift happens in the habit of customers, people are going to continue using Amazon, whether Amazon looks different or whether Amazon is treated differently in the corporate tax world or not. So it's really the very small businesses, your businesses that have less than 10 employees, your businesses that they're the ones that, frankly, in my opinion at least, should be treated exactly like, individuals are treated, because they are effectively like, kind of one man businesses. And that is, especially here in the Finger Lakes, we have so many of those. That is like sole proprietorships and very small LLCs or C Corps or whatever the case may be. Like, that is just the lifeblood of the economy. Coming in at number 7, though, which was really interesting, Wood Tax, which was a business in Yates County. They shut down and just kind of disappeared. They sold sheds, basically. And it seems like every so often we see one of these stories which really catches. And in this case, it was kind of interesting because the people who owned the business appeared to have a pretty sordid history in terms of similar sort of circumstances playing out in other states. And even to the point where as people went back to the company to try and get money back for sheds that they had purchased and hadn't yet been delivered, the people who owned the business had taken off. They were gone. So that's where that story stood. And it was really interesting because, that happens everywhere, right? But this was one of those things. And of course, this was one of the stories that took off particularly well on Facebook because it seemed like a lot of people had poor experiences with them. Number 6 was our first pandemic-related story. It was a story by Gabe Petrazio. A local healthcare worker was kicked out of Walgreens. It was interesting. It was a story that was read about 75,000 times when all was said and done. It happened during the spring peak, and basically the gist of this story was that the woman was on her break. She was actually working at a clinic across the road from the Walgreens in Geneva, was wearing scrubs, and walked into the store, was wearing face covering, all of that, but was asked to leave because she was wearing scrubs. And it was interesting because this shows just, in my mind, this shows just how just how on a knife's edge everything was in the spring. There was so much unknown about the virus, and even frontline healthcare workers, people who were literally saving lives in the spring, were being treated like, these creatures that were, potentially going to infect the world. Just one of the more sad stories, I guess, that we reported on the whole year. That's one that's worth going back and reading, because I think it shows kind of how far we've come, right? Like, nobody, when you're in the store, if you see someone who's wearing scrubs, Ted, do you freak out and wonder if they're if the virus is on them, jumping from them to other people?
Yeah, I mean, we complain about the way things are now, but we forget sometimes. I mean, I remember driving here to do these podcasts in March and just seeing, nothing open. The banks weren't open. The insurance offices weren't open. There was almost nobody on the street. It looked like some ABC Sunday night movie, from the 80s or something. So there was a lot of fear and a lot of unknown. You have a virus that comes from an exotic place, Wuhan, China, and all the stories about people buying bats in the marketplace to bring home for soup and all that kind of thing. I mean, all the ingredients were there.
Yeah, and then so jumping down to number 5, another feel-good story. This was pandemic-related. The Waterloo girls varsity softball team produced a video, a neat little sort of TikTok-themed video that wound up going, I'll say, regionally viral. It was viewed a whole bunch of times and something that got a lot of traction. It was a nice refresher, because this was also in that same sort of time frame, late spring, when everything was still really kind of up in the air in terms of what was going to happen. Softball season, like all other high school sports seasons, were abruptly cut, and kids were home. They weren't in. A lot was going on. So something good. And then number 4 was another story by Gabe that looked at, and this was interesting because we had been at this point covering nursing homes and the things that were happening in nursing homes, especially in the first wave of the pandemic, since basically the end of April and early May. And this particular story didn't publish until the beginning of August, and it was basically profiled a family. It was seeking answers over their loved one's death, plain and simple. Was it COVID related? Was it not COVID related? Death certificate basically painted one picture, that it was COVID related, but as it turns out, there were a lot of other medical issues that were let go at this particular facility. It was Elm Manor. We also did an intense series on Ontario Centre, both in Canandaigua, both places where the state had actually gone in at different times and conducted different spontaneous inspections, which are a little more rare in the nursing home space, as it turns out. A lot of inspections take place on sort of a schedule, and a lot of those scheduled visits and stress tests, effectively, that nursing homes would be put through were sidelined when the pandemic started. And it's interesting because this is one that just sort of never went away. So like another part of this that comes to mind that I highlighted in my column on Sunday here was that, there was basically a 90-day period where we filed a FOIL request with Ontario County to basically learn what they knew about what was going on in these nursing homes. And it took 90 days, about 90 days, for it to be fulfilled. And it just shows how, even with something that seems like it would be pretty straightforward, can get really, really muddied and really complicated when you have a crisis situation playing out. And I think, frankly, a lot of that has to do with how disorganized local government often is. And we talk about this a lot. These stories, especially when we're talking about the pandemic and how counties and businesses and healthcare facilities reacted to it, all marred by the fact that none of these entities were really prepared for what happened at all.
Well, and so much of the state focus was on things like gyms and barber shops and bowling alleys. And, I'm going to get a little political here, but the governor really doesn't want anybody looking very deeply into what happened at these nursing homes. He sent people who were positive back into an environment where it should have been expected it would be ripe for spread. And to this day, the questioning, he got very testy, and they've been very slow. I think the official number is 6,000 roughly deaths, but a lot of people are claiming that it might have been double that. Yeah. And I just think there's been a real attempt from the top on down in the state to not let anybody look into that very deeply, because it was, frankly, a big policy failure. And I'll use the word state, but we know who the leader of the state is.
And to that end, I mean, Lucas Day, for you guys, asked a really great question during one of his phone conferences over, I want to say it was either late summer or early fall.
Yeah.
Basically targeting in on that, and it caused a bit of uproar, because it is something that has been largely not discussed. And interestingly enough, I mean, this is something where I interviewed Bill Hammond from the Empire Center just a few weeks ago, and the whole conversation was about other things than nursing homes, but the Empire Center is leading that effort to get nursing home data. They've got FOIL requests into state DOH that have been ignored or that have not been acted on yet, or data the state has argued is just not available. I mean, just answers that frankly aren't good enough. And that is probably the still untold story about all of this, are the lives that were either lost or, the things that were complicated, frankly, by the fact that the state was acting in a more superficial manner than they really should have been.
And it goes back to a long-running theme on these broadcasts, which is government openness. There's still a tremendous lack of it, especially when anything gets uncomfortable. I mean, I think we need stronger freedom of information laws so that a government agency can't just... One of their favorite tactics is to stall you and hope that you'll just either give up, or by the time you get the information, the story's no longer relevant. So they just, we don't know, we can't find the records, they don't exist, we'll get back to you next year.
Number 3 this year was Walmart closed because of arson. So obviously we remember this. This was another one that happened about a month and a half before the pandemic really got its hands here on the Finger Lakes. But the store was closed for weeks, and it prompted an interesting story about 30 days after that Gabe did on food insecurity in the city of Geneva, because when a store like Walmart closes in a place like Geneva, where Tops had recently closed before that, creates this very interesting scenario. So no more BJ's Wholesale, Walmart closed, Tops had been gone the year before, and all you're left with is Wegmans. And Wegmans, while good for a lot of people, is regularly criticized for their prices being a little too high. I thought that one of the more interesting things, and this shows, frankly, the access that a lot of people have to transportation around here, their own personal transportation. The Walmart in Seneca Falls had higher than normal sales volume during that period. And then I talked to a couple folks in the Aldi organization, and they said the same thing. A couple regional folks who said the Seneca Falls store was performing way better than it ever had before. That happened during that window because of the price. I mean, there is a significant, when you're talking about the price of, say, a gallon of milk or, a dozen eggs, at Wegmans versus at Walmart and Aldi, it is a big, big difference. And, people, I think one of the things that goes underappreciated in Geneva is just how difficult the transportation piece is for a lot of folks. And I actually have an interview coming up. Well, the interview has been done, but we have a podcast coming up with Chris Lavin from the Boys and Girls Club, and some pretty exciting changes for them that are coming in the beginning of 2021 connected to food link and food access and distribution, which the Boys and Girls Club has been a huge part of. And it's just interesting because the entire reason why I had that conversation, and it's relevant to this story, is that people don't think about food access or food insecurity as major issues in any of these communities, whether you're talking about Seneca Falls, Geneva, Penn Yan, Newark, whatever the case may be. But there is an undercurrent, because as Chris said it to me yesterday while we were talking, this isn't something that you see on Main Street. You don't see food insecurity on Main Street. But man, it's there. It is all over the place, and it is not good. It is probably the biggest issue that any of these communities are facing. And there aren't a lot of good answers right now to addressing it. And not a lot of governing bodies have the funding or, frankly, the wherewithal at this point to come up with adequate solutions.
Well, and I think the food security problem stems from the transportation security problem.
Oh, yeah.
It's those of us who have a good, modern, working car that we jump in, turn the key, and drive anywhere we want. Sometimes I don't think we realize what it's like if you're not a person like that. So if you live in Ward 6 in Geneva and you're trying to get into Wegmans or Walmart, you can say, well, isn't there bus service? Well, yeah, there is, but it stops, I think, maybe every hour in certain locations. So if you're going up to Walmart, you might be looking at a 3-hour round trip to go get your groceries. And then if you're an elderly woman, or anybody really, I mean, you're shopping for a family of 4, how are you going to get 12 bags of groceries on the bus and get them home? I mean, those of us, again, my wife goes to the grocery, or I go to, we got to open the hatch on the Jeep and throw everything in the back and drive home. Yeah. A lot of people don't have that luxury, and it turns everything into a real difficulty. If you have to rely on the buses and, on an 11-degree day, stand out and wait for 45 minutes, and maybe it's running a few minutes late, and then you get your shopping done and you've missed the departure by 5 minutes, now the next bus is 55 minutes from now, that presents people with a lot of inconvenience.
If that, in our, especially if you get outside of Geneva, the public transportation system is horrific. It's not good in Geneva. It's not good anywhere here in the Finger Lakes once you're outside of Rochester or Syracuse, frankly. There aren't any sort of regular inexpensive transportation alternatives to your.
But it's extremely difficult to run any kind of system in a community that size economically. There just isn't enough demand for it. You can't get by running a bus service when there's going to be 2 people on the bus. I mean, I used to live in a college community in Massachusetts, and we were a 1-car family, so there was a while that I was taking buses. Mm-hmm. And I would sometimes find myself the only passenger on a full-size, Greyhound-sized bus. I mean, what's it cost to run that bus around for me and my 25 cents? It was a while ago, so it's probably not 25 anymore.
Well, and I think, I think that's a good point, because I think when we start to look at future transportation solutions, it has to look more like the rideshare model and less like the bus model.
Yeah, I think so.
The bus model shot. But no, that was, and we talked about it on your show a couple weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago. The announcement that Circle K was closing one of its locations, its main convenience store in Seneca Falls. And, I was amazed. I wrote a column, and a lot of the feedback that I got was, well, there's other convenience stores. And, and then also another part of it was, well, they can just walk if they have to the grocery store. And, there's only 2 other convenience stores in the former village of Seneca Falls. And my response to one of and I felt a little bad afterward, because I don't know the individual, but I know they're older. And, my response was, well, if it's so easy to walk to Walmart or Tops or Aldi, the next time you need groceries, a full load of groceries, you walk. walk and go get them.
Well, and for that matter, I mean, are there even sidewalks down by the plaza? I mean, here in Seneca Falls, where Aldi is,
There is now. Yeah, there is.
Okay, because I would say some of these four-lane roads, that's not, for example, the Geneva Walmart is right up the road from our radio station. There's no sidewalk going up that street. You have to walk along the side of a four-lane road and then dash across. And then, like I say, so now you've got your 8 bags of groceries. How are you getting those home as a walker?
Right. Well, and plus on top of that, I remember as a kid, my mom would take me on bike rides all the time, and we'd go up into we lived in Seneca Falls in the village or former village, and we would ride up to like Penny's place and then the Liberty Plaza there, and that bike ride was a 25 or 30-minute bike ride. I mean, granted, I was a little kid, but still, I mean, if it's taking that long on a bicycle, how long is it taking on foot?
Right.
And how are you getting back into town? So, like, people say, well, why would anybody be shopping in a convenience store? Because they can run to the convenience store that's around the corner and just grab 2 or 3 things or 1 bag of things and get by for a day or two and then do it again a little bit after that. Now, I realize that there's huge problems with that because it's more expensive. They aren't getting as good a quality food items, but short of there being some sort of delivery service or transportation methodology, I think personally, if I'm just spitballing solutions, I think that it's a hybrid between a rideshare method to address the transportation side and then a delivery method that basically takes Instacart and uses that style of food delivery to those who need it as a viable means to getting good food, like a good wide range of food to people who otherwise just don't have access to it.
And I think, it's obviously the younger generation that's leading the way in the use of a lot of these things. So as that use spreads, it then becomes more economical. That's always the problem with something. It's like starting up a bus service. You can't afford to start a bus service if there's going to be 3 passengers. If there's going to be 300, you're fine. So if more people begin to adopt, circling back to what we said before about convenience, if more people start using those kinds of services, it becomes more economical. So if your delivery run is to 12 households instead of 1, now you can probably do that and make it economical and make it work for you as a business and make it work for the customer in terms of the price they have to pay.
Yeah. And so our second most read story of the year was about stimulus checks, or the stimulus checks that were thrown away. It was interesting because, this is just such a funny, to me it was such a funny thing because we were well into the stimulus process at this point, but it was connected to those debit cards, for those of you who don't remember, that were getting thrown away because they look like junk mail.
I came very close.
And I had a lot of friends who either texted me or sent me pictures of it saying, like, is this legit? Is this real? And some of them were older, some of them were younger. And it was interesting because this was one of those ones that there were a lot of, and I haven't seen any numbers yet. It's sort of basically a snapshot of how many the federal government had to resend because they were thrown away. But I would hazard a guess, judging by the amount of traction that our stories in this lane were getting during this period and the amount of feedback that I got from different people, that they probably had to send out tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these things a second time, which cost, I can only imagine how much.
Well, and one of the problems was they didn't want porch pirates grabbing these, so they didn't want to dress them up in official looking. Yeah. They weren't going to put them in an envelope that said, here's your $2,400 debit card for your couple, that's what we got in my household. So they sent it in this kind of plain, generic-looking envelope, which looks like all of the junk, plain, generic stuff that we get every single day. So I consider myself fairly savvy in these things, and I looked at it for a long time and read and checked and Googled and went, okay, this is really it. So that's a tough one because I don't know how you, other than maybe a better education system, but then if you educate the public, now you're educating the porch pirates. Here's what to look for if you want to rip it off. So you'd think there would have been a better way to do some kind of direct deposit. Now, in my case, the reason I got the card instead of a direct deposit is the direct deposit only went to people who got refunds on their tax return. I didn't get a refund that previous year. I paid in. And as a result, that took me out of that realm, even though if the IRS had really dug, I'm sure they have my bank records somewhere in terms of my account number and my routing number to send me a direct payment.
Yeah, I think, and that's going to be one of the interesting things that I'll be watching over the next 2 weeks, because what I've heard several times is that the checks are coming next week, or they'll start coming next week.
Yeah.
And it looks like the IRS is leaning more into direct deposit this time around than they did the first time. Number one story of the year, most read story of the year. Any guess, any idea what might have been the biggest story of the year, or even in
That's
just
always
general
hard, because
topic?
it's probably something from last January or something that we've forgotten all about.
February, as it turns out.
We haven't had any environmental garbage burning incinerator stories yet.
Yeah.
Anything like that?
It's not actually. It is the day that, so our coverage from the day that the Cayuga Nation demolished the gas station in Seneca Falls and all of the properties around it.
Old news.
Yeah, old news. It was interesting because that was one that sort of like slow burned over the course of like 2 months, but really, despite the fact that it was getting a ton of traffic, not just locally, but like this story was getting picked up across the country, especially within the covering this. I learned just how in depth the Native American network is across the entire country, the publications in different regions and the folks in different areas of the country that actually watch everything across the whole country and really intuitively sort of get in touch with each other and share different things and things like that. This was one that slow burned, though, because it got stuck behind the pandemic. It happened right at the end of January, I believe, and sort of played out through the month of February. And then, by March, everyone was preoccupied with the pandemic and shutdowns and everything like that. But there was a lot that was still unresolved there. You had the two factions of the Cayuga Nation at odds with one another. It's still not resolved, obviously. But we've seen some advances there. I will say this from the folks who keep sending me emails every week. It seems I get at least one or two emails from people saying, when are the other properties going to be razed the rest of the way, demolished properly the rest of the way? I think the answer is I don't know. And I don't think anybody else knows either, unfortunately, because while there is desire to see the other properties on the what would be I suppose the east side of 89 be pulled out the rest of the way, it's contingent on taxes being paid. And right now that isn't something that the county's willing to budge on. So there we sit. That was your number one story. Those were your top 10 most read stories of the year. And yeah, it's interesting what was missing. I was really surprised that there was not more coronavirus stuff in there. Those stories were really highly read, but I think it's interesting that at the end of the day, there was so much of that the attention or the eyeballs were sort of spread out across hundreds of stories, as opposed to being sort of laser focused on a couple stories that were really trained in on a specific issue connected to them. The environmental stuff, like you mentioned, environmental stories do really well. They perform well, but the interesting thing to me is that the only one that we had that came close was the Butler sludge processing facility, and it got killed. I think if we didn't have the pandemic, I think that would have been the story of the year, because I think it would have had a more legitimate shot at getting through. If you look at that meeting, and it's interesting because that particular that meeting, the first meeting in Butler when this project was unveiled, was the last really heavily attended in-person meeting of 2020 in the Finger Lakes region. The room was packed. It was clearly not safe to be there. It happened in March. But at the end of the day, had that, had that been able to progress, I think we would have seen the people who were involved, the developers involved in that, push harder to make it happen. And I think we would have seen a lot more attention paid to it in the news cycle. Unfortunately, it kind of got buried.
Well, another thing
interesting.
Conspicuously missing is the whole ongoing depot saga, but that's probably more because that's been ongoing. There isn't really one story you can hang your hat on. I mean, we had the news about Hillside, and then
I think that was a matter of it played out, because I want to say that the news that the White Deer tours were going to cease under the Seneca White Deer umbrella and its previous ownership was one of the, I think that fell in our top 10 from 2019.
Yeah.
But it didn't carry over very well. And then, this was definitely the sale of the former Hillside property was definitely one of the bigger stories that we saw here in the region. But at the end of the day, again, pandemic, lots of other things on people's minds, and just, it affected every aspect of people's lives in terms of what they would normally consume. It kind of bent what they normally consumed. And, it'll be interesting to see what comes out on the other side of this. What kind of stories stand out when we do start to get on the backside of the pandemic here? Because I think to some degree, there's going to be a lot of tired folks who just are burned out from news in general. So maybe we'll start to see a bit of good news make a comeback. Good news comeback.
That'd be nice.
Okay, so we got 3 questions that hit here at the end of the show. Number 1, and these are the questions that are the bigger ones heading into 2021 that have been kind of percolating throughout the year. We've talked about them a few different times. First up, what's going to happen to school? How is the K through 12 experience going to change, and might it happen this year? Thoughts on where we're going. I've got a few bullet points that I want to hit, but they're kind of just quick thoughts. So go ahead. And what do you think is going to happen in the next year?
Well, I think that remote learning hasn't worked. I think it could. So that's one thing, is to study what's been wrong. I think part of it is unequal access to technology. We talked earlier about the food deserts. It's easy for those of us who have a computer at home with a nice big monitor and a wired internet connection to think that everybody does, but everybody doesn't. I think that's been part of it. I think part of it